Great. Are we live, Beck?
We are.
Great.
Letting people filter in.
All right. Well, I have 12:01, so let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Brown Bag webinar on environmental governance. My name is Chelsea Batavia. I'm a senior environmental scientist, and on behalf of the Delta Science program, I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar. This is the first of a three-part webinar series hosted by the Delta Science program with an overarching focus on governance in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. I'd like to open today's program by inviting Delta lead scientist Dr. Laurel Larson to say a few words acknowledging the original inhabitants and stewards of the Delta estuary's lands and waters, whose governance we will be discussing today. Laurel.
Thank you, Chelsea, and happy March, everyone. The focus of this Brown Bag series is governance in the Delta. As we engage in discussion around this topic, we must also reckon with the understanding that current institutional arrangements, power structures, and decision-making processes that comprise contemporary governance of the Bay Delta estuary are the product of Western colonial settlement, which displaced the governance systems of Native American peoples who continually occupied, managed, and stewarded the landscape for thousands of years. We acknowledge that the Delta and the larger Bay Estuary is located within the ancestral territory of the native peoples of the numerous villages and tribes of the Bay Miwok, Coast Miwok, Plains Miwok, Maidu, Nisenan, Ohlone, Patwin, Pomo, Wafo, Wintun, and Wilcox, who make up the tribal groups both recognized and unrecognized. We acknowledge that the Delta Stewardship Council, Delta Science Program, and other organizations represented here today are guests who have benefited from the violent history of colonization, displacement, and dispossession of Native peoples from their traditional homelands. We wish to show our respect to them, their ancestors, and their sovereignty by acknowledging the injustices inherent in this history and their current efforts to achieve restorative justice. We acknowledge the ancestors, elders, and relatives and affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples. Consistent with the values of community, inclusion, and diversity, it is vitally important that we recognize that the land on which we reside is unceded tribal territory and acknowledge and support the Native peoples who continue to form a crucial part of the Bay Delta community today. Tribal communities have been stewarding our natural environment since time immemorial. There is much we need to learn from the estuary's tribal communities about responsible stewardship and good governance. Please consider that although this statement acknowledges the ancestral and unceded territories of the original Native peoples of the Bay Delta estuary, additional steps are required to move towards meaningful restorative justice. This series is intended to catalyze reflection and dialogue on the distribution of power as it exists today, as a legacy of Western colonial settlement, and encourage actions supporting tribes in exercising their authority as sovereign governing bodies and the original stewards of the estuary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Larson. With that important context, I will now introduce the topic of this series and today's session. As many of you here may have experienced, governance is a common topic of discussion in Delta science management and policy circles. It's also something we're all participating in various ways, whether through formal government roles, through community coalitions, through engagement in public participatory processes, through production or communication of scientific research, or any other number of channels. And yet, even though governance is something we are all doing, so to speak, we don't spend a lot of time talking about what it is or what it means. At the same time, scholars of governance in the social sciences have acknowledged that governance is, quote, a notoriously slippery term. And so to gain traction on this seemingly ubiquitous, but in many ways elusive concept, we've convened our panel today and in the next two webinars to reflect on the question, what is Delta governance anyway? The main goal of the series is to learn and foster discussion about governance in the Delta. We've organized three panels of speakers who will shed light on the social, political, and institutional dimensions of Delta science and management, helping us think about how institutional structures and processes support effective and equitable environmental management. Another main goal of the series is to raise awareness and understanding of governance as a topic of social scientific inquiry. To this end, each webinar will focus on a different social scientific framework that can be used to understand Delta governance. The framework for today's panel is environmental governance. I'm going to leave it largely to our first speaker to explain how social scientists define environmental governance, but in broad strokes, the term refers to the processes, structures, and institutions within which decision-making and action for the environment occur, in this case in the Delta. Today, we have an excellent lineup of panelists who will provide insights on environmental governance in the Delta from multiple angles. We'll open with a presentation by social scientist and governance scholar, Dr. Mark Lubell, and then we'll hear from three speakers representing perspectives from federal, state, and local levels of government in the Delta. For the first hour or so, we'll hear presentations from each individual panelist, and then we're hoping to leave plenty of time for panel discussion. We invite you to use the chat feature to comment throughout the presentations and converse with other attendees. We also strongly encourage you to submit questions, which you may direct either to the full panel or to individual speakers. Please use the QA feature in Zoom to submit your questions, and a moderator will read them during the discussion portion of the webinar. The panel discussion is going to be co-moderated by my colleague and California Sea Grant social scientist, Jessica Rudnick. I'd like to take this opportunity to give a special thanks to Jess for all her support conceptualizing and organizing the webinar series. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank our two other Brown Bag co-organizers, Lauren Hastings and Jenica Moffett, as well as our excellent webinar support staff member, Beck Barker. Finally, before introducing our first speaker, I want to note that although our panel today will speak to a diverse range of institutions, structures, and processes in the US government sector, this particular webinar will not focus on tribal government. Because the US government sector encompasses the formal and centralized entities currently holding the major authority to make and implement decisions in the Delta, US government seemed a useful and illuminating starting point for this series. In next month's webinar, we'll hear from a representative of a regional tribal government, United Auburn Indian Community, to learn about tribal governance systems and how they interface with the US sectors of government. I'll provide additional information about what to expect in the next two webinars at the end of today's panel discussion. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Mark Lubell. Dr. Lubell is a professor of environmental science and policy and the director of the Center for Environmental Policy and Behavior at University of California, Davis. His research focuses on human behavior and the role of governance institutions in facilitating cooperation and solving collective action problems which occur when individuals make self-interested decisions that produce socially undesirable outcomes. He's published over 100 articles reporting on theoretical as well as lab-based and field-based research using quantitative and qualitative social scientific methods. Dr. Lubell is highly engaged in advising on Delta environmental policy, serving on the Leadership Advisory Group for BCDC's Bay Adapts Program and Delta Science Program Science Advisory Committee, among others. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Lubell.
Thank you, everybody. Now I need to share my screen, right? Reshare it? All right.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you everybody for participating and for the invitation to speak in this brown bag. You can see the title of my talk here is What is Environmental Governance? All my information is down there, including my Twitter handle. If you kind of like to follow on this sort of stuff, you can check it out there. I'm always happy to have some Twitter conversation as part of the outreach that I do. So many of you may think you know what environmental governance is, or have a question, or want to think that environmental, or hopefully know that environmental governance is one of the key things that we need to solve. But as social scientists, we like to have lots of different definitions of environmental governance. And here's kind of the set that some of the most important ones. So I think the typical way that people think about it is some sort of rules. It may come from legislation or administrative decision-making, maybe an executive order. And so the sets of processes and mechanisms and organizations through which political actors influence environmental actions and outcomes. So how the rules that structure how we collectively get together and make decisions, that set of rules. And when people think about, oh, we're going to make a policy change or make some sort of take a legislative action, they're often thinking of those rules. But there's lots of other ways to think of it. So network governance thinks about, there's a whole set of actors that are out there, organizations that are networked together in various ways, and how do you coordinate action and decision making across that network? Collaborative governance, that emphasizes the role of the drivers and the structures that enable actors to work together across these networks, across all the different policy forums in which they are operating. Polycentric governance is an idea that really was evolved over the years with sort of culminating in the work of Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics a few years ago, where you have many different policy forums, many different actors dealing with many different issues all at the same time, or at multiple levels of geographic scale, and they could be cooperating or not within that very complex system. And then you have the idea of adaptive governance, which adds on to the idea of polycentric governance, but also thinks about how governance systems change in response to uncertainty over time, make decisions, get new information, and adapt. And that's similar to adaptive management. And these are just a few. I would say these are some of the main definitions, but there are other ones. For example, anticipatory governance, how to get a governance system to think forward in the future. So I really am an adherent of sort of the messy part of this, in the sense that when you look at the reality of environmental governances out there, it's almost always quite messy with many different actors, many different policy forums. There's no one unified set of rules out there that's integrating everything, always dealing with multiple issues at the same time. And there's evidence to support this perspective. So many of you probably know this fellow up here, Phil Eisenberg, who's been involved in California water for a very long time. And for all I know, Phil could be in the audience. If you are, raise your hand. But he, in response to one of the articles I wrote, he wrote, "Public policy is almost always a mess. Let's acknowledge the inevitable and figure out how to manage a messy situation." And he characterized policy, environmental governance, as situations in which everyone is involved, but nobody was in charge. And that's a very difficult, if not impossible, situation to deal with. And then Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, echoed this from her theoretical perspective and says, to explain the world of interactions and outcomes occurring at multiple levels, we have to be willing to deal with complexity instead of rejecting it. So the sort of work I do and the advice that I provide people and the engagement that I do around governance is really trying to help people understand how to deal with these messy polycentric systems, how to navigate them. So as social scientists, we use lots of different approaches to looking at this. So we do qualitative research, we interview people like yourselves, semi-structured interviews of key stakeholders and key informants. We sit in meetings and do participant observation. Of course, we read lots of documents and look at meeting minutes and plans and things like that to get a sense of what's going on. I myself do a lot of surveys. I'm sure some of you on this call have received and hopefully answered some of my surveys. If you haven't, if you refuse to answer them in the past, I hope you answer them next time, because surely I'll send out more at some point. So surveys give you a more quantitative approach, and we do surveys of stakeholders, or, for example, Jess is working on a survey of Delta communities and citizens right now. We look at online sources, so looking at plans, looking at who works with who to look at networks. We get the data from those various sources, and we subject it to standard statistical analysis, standard statistical models used in social sciences, such as regression analysis, but lots of other more sophisticated statistical modeling approaches. And myself, I do a lot of work on network analysis, looking at the nodes that are involved. Like over here in the example is a former Delta science fellow and student of mine, Matthew Robbins, put this network together, and these are some of the organizations that are involved with science in the Delta Science Enterprise, all those different colors. And then there's the dark blue nodes, and there are different collaborative science being used in which they participate. In the edges there are the who participates in which venues. So we look at those networks and think about what are their structures and who's most central in them, what sorts of structures in there support different sorts of social processes. So I'll just give you a quick taste of some of this, looking at a few different case studies: San Francisco Bay Water Management, IRWM, looking at the types of structures that support cooperation and learning, a little taste of sea level rise adaptation in the Bay Area, and then a little taste of science governance in the Delta Science program, Delta Science Enterprise. So many of you probably know integrated regional water management, one of the key pillars of the California Water Plan, with the idea that you're going to try to set up these planning efforts and implementation efforts to fund, at least cost share, projects that integrate across multiple watershed sorts of issues in these regions. And I've did some work a while ago in the San Francisco IRWM program. I always like to point out that because California is special, we call it integrated regional water management. In the international level, a lot of similar ideas around integrated water resources management. So IWRM. California has to flip the R and the W. So when I did my work on San Francisco, I basically tried to identify all of the people that were participating in IRWM and water management in San Francisco Bay, starting with their list of actors on their plan. And I sent them a survey, and I asked them this question here. There are many different forums and processes available for participating in water management and planning in the Bay Area. Gave them a definition of planning processes and asked them to list up to 3. So 58% of the respondents answered this question. The majority nominated 3 institutions. And the quick little audience participation here, I think you can use the chat. It's like, how many different sorts of policy forums do you think I identified? IRWM is 1. They could list up into 3. How many total in the Bay Area do you think that I identified using this question? Can they do text?
Yes, you can chime in the chat.
Brief audience participation. How many do you think I got? I'm not seeing any chat. Oh, there we go. I've seen it now. I got it, yeah. So 75, 50 plus, 30, 50. I see Kathy Schaefer in here and Luis. Now, and some other people that have seen my work before, I might have to dismiss some of yours, but your average estimate is low. The actual answer is over 100 different policy forums operating just in San Francisco Bay around water management in the way I approach this question. So what you see here on the screen here is all the policy actors in the red who answered the survey or were identified as participants, and the blue squares are all the policy forums. That big blue square is IRWM. And CalFed is actually the second biggest square, because at the time I did the survey, CalFed still existed, which is kind of an interesting story in and of itself. These systems are evolving. We know that CalFed died, so to speak, and was resurrected as the Delta Stewardship Council. That just shows you the complexity, and basically every watershed in the country has some variant of this messy sort of system. And when you do the analysis on this, you'll see that there's structures in here that support both learning and information sharing and cooperation. So these are multifunctional, complex, polycentric governance systems. This is the reality. People like Don and Carl Wilcox have seen this stuff before, and I often, when I show it to, for example, the Stewardship Council or BCDC, I often feel this is like a form of therapy. It's kind of like the Rorschach test that people look at, It's like, what do you see in this? And a lot of people say, oh, finally, somebody has recognized how complicated these systems are. And then they look to me and say, well, how do we solve these sorts of problems? Because this is the Gordian knot of governance right here. How do you cut through this and get something done? That's the difficult problem. So the sort of research I do, at least, and lots of my colleagues do, tries to get at those. And we're still working on that ourselves, but we're making progress. Okay, let's take a look at the Bay Area. So here's, we know sea level rise and is the key climate adaptation issue in the Bay Area. They're engaged in a lot of planning around that. When I did a similar survey more recently of sea level rise stakeholders, I asked them to select what are the top 3 things that they want to do in terms of solutions and problems. And what you see is they all want a plan, they all want collaboration, but nobody wants a regional authority. So it's like they all want to get together and cooperate, but they don't want anybody to tell them what to do about it. So how do you deal with a system where nobody wants to give up any control of the authority. So what's happened over time in the Bay Area is I looked at the network. This is not actually from the survey. This are from the sets of plans that are out there around adaptation planning in the Bay Area. And I sliced it up into different points of time. And what you see is it started as kind of a sparse network that had the Bay Area IRWM was starting to talk about sea level rise. And then over time, this network has really grown. And a lot more local programs have come in, a lot more local actors have come in. So you see the growth of a regional governance system for sea level rise in the Bay Area, but it's not a process of centralization where some central actors are taking control of everything. Rather, it's more of a process of decentralization. So where you see lots of the growth of local actors connecting to local venues and regional actors connecting to local venues. So in climate change science, like we talk a lot about downscaling climate effects, and this is downscaling governance, how you take this regional problem, downscale it to the local level, bring regional resources to the local level to shape the behavior of all those local governments and special districts that you have in the Bay Area. It's a very fragmented system at the local level. Okay, and then you also see this for the governing science for policy and adaptive management in the Delta Science Enterprise. So this is work I'm pretty sure some of you participate in this survey that we just completed, just delivered a report. We haven't written the papers yet, but just delivered a report to the Delta Science program on this. So we took all the various collaborative science forums in the Delta, tried to use them as the gateways to sending out a survey. And these are the responses we got from the various programs. And you can see there's lots of different programs here, like the IEP, the STAGs, the DPICs, et cetera, that are out there that are places where science is communicated and developed in the science enterprise. And the science enterprise is supposed to help support the implementation of the adaptive management framework of the Delta Management Plan. So this is kind of what people participated in. And then what we did in the surveys, we asked them to name the central form. So one of them, somebody may say, the main one I participate in is IEP. And then for the main one in which they participated, we asked them to evaluate that program in terms of how effectively it pursues all these adaptive management goals, which we split into the plan, do, evaluate, and respond stages of that adaptive management cycle. You can see they're all rated as somewhat effective, but they all are rated as doing the best on kind of identifying the nature of the Delta problems, not as well rated on the do part, actually getting something done, a little bit better rated on the evaluate and respond there at the bottom. And an interesting piece for me is that all of them are as viewed as doing pretty well on communicating science and analyzing and synthesizing data. So throughout that adaptive management process, the role of these different science forms in communication and translation is key. We also asked them what are the barriers to adaptive management, how satisfied are they with these various drivers is a better way to say it. You can see that they thought they were fair, and had decent financial resources, and trust was pretty good. But at the bottom is presence of effective leadership, representation of diverse perspectives, and coordination with the other sorts of science forums that are out there. So dealing with that messy situation. And it's interesting when I don't have the graph here, but when you show which of these drivers are the most important in predicting the success of adaptive management, the most important drivers are the leadership and trust and fairness. The least important drivers are actually the financial and staff. So when you look at the function of the science enterprise with respect to adaptive management, the financial and staff resources that people spend a lot of time talking about appear to be less important than the social processes of leadership and trust. So hopefully that gives you a little introduction. I've kind of came up with a slide in some brown bag that I was at where this thing had come across, and Maven in Twitter had written this tweet. Says, do you know any illustrations that attempt to visualize all California policy issues in one scene? And Maven took this and drew this big scribble. And that was her view, is how complex it is. So, and I said, well, you know what, we're doing science on this. So we take a social science approach to understanding these systems by having ways to measure them, having ways to analyze them. And we hope by doing that, that we generate some knowledge about how these systems operate, their structure and their function. And by using that knowledge, we can help untie those Gordian knots and help people build governance structures and navigate governance structures in ways that enhance learning and cooperation, the capacity to come up with equitable solutions and negotiate and bargain across all the costs and benefits, which we think are the processes that we need to have resilient social ecological systems in the Delta and other places as well. So that's it for me. Can't wait to hear what other people have to say and to see how it reflects on my thinking about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lubell, for that excellent social scientific overview. That was interesting and illuminating and perhaps therapeutic for some, and I hope that increases the sample sizes in the future. Next up, we have Kylie Allen. Kylie Allen is the Assistant Regional Director for the Fish and Aquatic Conservation Program in the California Great Basin region of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She's held that position since January of 2021. Previously, she served as the Field Supervisor of the San Francisco Bay Delta Fish and Wildlife Office in Sacramento, California. She's worked for the service since November 2015. From February 2000 to November 2015, Kylie worked for the Department of the Interior's Regional Solicitor's Office in Sacramento as an Assistant Regional Solicitor. In that capacity, she advised on legal issues primarily associated with water law, endangered species, administrative law, environmental issues, and torts. Kylie holds a JD from UC Davis School of Law and did her undergraduate work at UC Davis. Please join me in welcoming Kylie Allen.
Great, thank you. And thank you for asking me to be here. I find this topic just fascinating. So it's really interesting to hear what people have to say about it. So I'm going to be providing just a brief overview of the services structure and the Department of the Interior structure, and then touch briefly on federal authorities, sort of touch points where federal agencies may be engaged in Delta issues, Delta governance. The majority of my comments will be focused on reviewing my personal lessons learned from the CalFed process and the various iterations of CalFed. My comments are primarily focused on the state-federal relationship, and that is not to downplay tribal or local governments and their role in environmental governance. But again, my comments are focused on my lessons learned and from my experience, and that has been primarily in the state-federal arena. And again, these are just my thoughts. These don't represent policy positions of the Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of the Interior. So next slide. So this is just a really high-level overview of the way the Fish and Wildlife Service is structured. And I thought this would help to provide some context for those of you who aren't intimately involved on the federal side. The service is divided into programs. So I am over the Fish and Aquatic Conservation Program in our region. The Fish and Aquatic Conservation Program deals with the national hatchery system. So we have several hatcheries in this region, as well as data collection and monitoring and restoration efforts. At each level, the national level and the regional level, we have a director or a regional director. So our director is Martha Williams. She was just confirmed last week, which is super exciting. We're so happy to have her on board permanently. Our regional director is Paul Souza, who many of you have probably worked with. We have deputy directors at the national level and a regional deputy director at the regional level, and then assistant directors over each program at the national level and assistant regional directors over the programs at the regional level. So on oftentimes you might be dealing with multiple people in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and chances are you're dealing with people in multiple programs. And I think just like all big agencies, we're not always the best at talking to each other. So just sort of an FYI there. Next slide, please. So this is a basic structure of the Department of the Interior. And I just wanted to highlight a few things here. So the secretary and deputy secretary are up there at the top, and then there are assistant secretaries over various agencies. So the Fish and Wildlife Service is under the Assistant Secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, along with the National Park Service. And then Reclamation and the USGS are under the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science. And I wanted to highlight this because at various times in my career on Delta issues, sometimes the secretary and the deputy secretary are heavily involved. Other times it is the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science tends to take the lead role, or the Commissioner for Reclamation will tend to, one of those two will tend to lead efforts in the region. Next slide, please. So this is by no means a comprehensive list, but it's just sort of a list of authorities where federal agencies may engage in Delta governance. Obviously, we need to implement our authorities. And that sort of creates, I think, that spaghetti chart that Mark showed, where there's a lot of different forums and a lot of different players, but not always are the same agencies in the same forums. But there's definitely a lot of acts and laws that we're implementing that give us sort of a foray into the Delta. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to reminisce, I guess, a little bit about the Cal-Fed Bay Delta program. So back in the day when Cal-Fed was conceived in the mid-90s, it was a consortium of state and federal agencies. And those agencies were working to, what we'd always say, fix the Delta. And the program primarily was tasked with developing a program to improve Delta conditions and to study that. So they were preparing a NEPA and CEQA documents to study the program that they had developed. And at the time, there was no legal entity that was the program. It was staff from each of the agencies that were participating that were co-located and working together to develop that program. And I think that structure actually worked pretty well. I noticed that was one of the various definitions that Mark went through, sort of that collaborative processing. Where it didn't work so well is that there was no cognizable legal entity that was the Cal-Fed Bay Delta program. So they couldn't take actions, they couldn't let contracts, they couldn't do the things that government generally does to implement a program. So I think while we were in that study phase, again, it was working pretty well. We had various structures that were helping guide the development of the program. There was a federal advisory committee that the secretary led at the time that helped advise the program. And I will say the program itself was a very high priority within the Department of the Interior. Both Secretary Bruce Babbitt and Deputy Secretary David Hayes at the time were very, very engaged in Delta issues and in the Cal-Fed program. So the study, the NEPA and CEQA documents that were done led to a record of decision in 2000. And we all thought at the time that we would get federal legislation, we could essentially codify what we had been doing as part of the program, and we could move forward. Unfortunately, federal legislation didn't come until 2004. And so that created created multiple issues on the federal side, I would say. One of those was we had a change in administration with the election in 2000, and the White House changed from one party to another, and California in general, but certainly the Delta was not a high priority for the next administration. And so we as federal agencies just didn't have as much support on that. And I think we also didn't have a governance structure that could support sort of that one side shifting away at the time. I think in order for the feds to really participate in any sort of governance structure that actually has decision-making and authority, we need congressional legislation to be able to do that. I mean, we can participate in that collaborative form that Mark discussed, but I think to really create that legal entity that was CalFed, we needed federal legislation. That didn't come. So I think sort of all of those things conspired to slow down the progress of what was going on in the program. We did finally get federal legislation in 2004, but it didn't really address the governance piece of that. It was more around the funding and authorities to take actions. So that didn't help us on that side. So the state kind of took matters into their own hands, I would say, and they passed legislation in 2002 that created the California Bay Delta Authority as a state agency. And that act did contemplate federal participation, but there's really no mechanism in state law to make federal agencies participate. And so I would say the level of participation that was envisioned didn't occur. And this led to more federal disengagement from the program. And then fast forward to 2009 with the Delta Reform Act creating the Delta Stewardship Council and this Delta Science Program. I would say from a federal perspective, or at least my perspective, that change, the processes became a little bit more opaque. I think from the federal side, there was just a lot more entities doing what seemed like a lot more things, and it's been harder to track and to know where best for us to insert ourselves and be useful. I also think that in that time frame, we were dealing with a lot of endangered species issues in the Delta. There was obviously litigation over biological opinions that took a lot of, I think, time and energy. And additionally, we were working on the Bay Delta Conservation Plan at the time. So that seemed to be more of the focus of the federal agencies, I think, at the time, which has made, I think, the Delta Stewardship Council has been doing a lot of work in that time, but we weren't necessarily a part of all of it. So it's been harder to keep up, I think, at least from my standpoint. So next slide, please. So I guess just in closing, I was thinking about a couple of different things. So the functionality, the function of what a governmental entity is, or a governance entity is trying to accomplish, and sort of the permanence aspect. To me, given the election cycles, which I think the influence of that cannot be understated, especially because the presidential cycle and governor cycle are off. So really, you only have 2 years in each cycle that things can be accomplished potentially if the state and federal administrations are so inclined. And so I think that legislation really does help create that permanence, and it can define more clearly what federal functions would be in terms of governance. However, I also think there's a lot that we can accomplish without sort of that joint decision making or more set structure. A lot of that collaboration that was discussed earlier, I think a lot of that can be accomplished, but each agency needs to retain their own decision making, and that can cause issues at times. But I think we do generally, as the agencies, worked pretty well together. And so I think when we're thinking about governance, it helps to sort of to define what are we trying to accomplish with any given governance structure, what's really needed, like, do you really need legislation? And if you do, then that's a long road to get through that and to have that get past Congress. So I think that's it for me. And I will pass it along. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Kylie. That was really insightful, and we appreciate you sharing your perspectives candidly and openly. That was really fascinating. So thank you very much. Next, we have Carl Wilcox. Carl Wilcox recently retired from his role as policy advisor on the Delta for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. In this position, he directed the department's involvement in a range of policy issues related to the state and federal water operations, as well as California Water Fix and Eco Restore. He also participated in multiple collaborative forums representing CDFW on the Collaborative Adaptive Management team as part of the Collaborative Science and Adaptive Management Program, and serving as the CDFW policy lead for the Interagency Ecological Program. Prior to his role as policy advisor, Carl also held positions as chief of the water branch and later the Bay Delta regional manager for CDFW. Carl continues to serve on a wide variety of advisory councils and committees in the Delta, including the Delta Science Program's Science Advisory Committee. Thank you for joining us, Carl, and please everybody join me in welcoming Carl Wilcox.
Thank you, Chelsea. It's an honor to be here, and I'm finding it very interesting. I really appreciate Kylie's thoughts and approach to talking about this, looking at kind of the CalFed, Bay Delta Authority to the Stewardship Council, and highlighting the issues around kind of, I don't know, consistency within government and or administrations, because all of this, particularly effective governance or development of effective conservation activities requires a lot of time and consistent participation to be able to come to some resolution, particularly one that's broad-based and sustainable. So I just wanted to make those comments going in. So first slide, I'm just going to talk quickly about the department's role. The department is the trustee for the state's fish and wildlife resources. The state initiated in the form of a wildlife commission in 1870, a program to look and protect and conserve fish and wildlife resources, particularly as it related to dam building and maintaining fisheries and fish and wildlife resources. So, going all the way back to then. And the commission is in the state's constitution. The department's mission is broadly focused on conservation of species, plants, animals, and the habitats they depend on. So, non-game, game species, as well as broader conservation of habitat to protect and minimize and avoid the potential for listing. Its activities are prioritized based on or by statute, regulations, and funding availability to implement those mandates. And I think that's a kind of a key component to keep in mind with at least our department, is that our ability to implement programs is often driven by the ability to fund them. We may have the mandate, but we may not have the funding to really effectively implement that. And the department's budget is subject to appropriations by the legislature as part of the state budget. And in the case of the department, much of our work historically has been funded by fees, whether it's hunting or fishing licenses, and more recently, fee-based for some of the regulatory programs. And that tends to be a controversial area, but also one that limits our ability as an agency to work, let's say, more independently to engage with communities. So if your funding is tied to a specific funding source that limits your activities, then you can't be doing something else that may be more focused on community engagement, and you're focused primarily on writing permits or something like that. The department's part of the Natural Resources Agency, which houses 43 entities that are responsible for managing the resources of the state of California. And not all of the resources, since agencies like the Water Resources Control Board are housed within Cal EPA, but agencies within the department, primary ones that relate to the Delta are the Department of Water Resources, a sister agency of the department, and one that we work very closely with in many forms, both science and management related to the Delta. The Delta Stewardship Council, the Delta Protection Commission, and the San Joaquin Bay or Delta Bay Conservancy. Next slide. The department, just to kind of provide an organizational framework, the department has a director, a chief deputy director, and then is divided into two major program components related to resource management. I'm going to talk about the administrative side, but we have an ecosystem conservation division, which includes a water branch that's focused on water-related activities, and particularly operations of the state and federal water project, in-stream flow, providing advice to the State Water Resources Control Board, and those kinds of things. And then a habitat conservation planning branch that works on large-scale conservation and oversees many of the department's regulatory programs. And then on the other side are the Fish and Wildlife Division, which are primarily focused on species management, habitat management, and that kind of thing, and overseeing hunting and fishing programs within the department. So those are kind of the two major organization elements. In the headquarters, that provides a policy direction, and then the department has 7 regions within the state. These are geographical areas or subdivisions of the department that implement the programs and policies at the department at the local level. So in the Bay Delta, there is the department's region is the Bay Delta region, which was created in 2006 to tie San Francisco Bay to the Delta and try to integrate activities across that region. It's a very diverse region in that the Bay, from let's say a conservation and management perspective, is a very different place than the Delta. As far as its governance structure, the way people look at conservation activities and those kinds of things, and how emphasis is placed on, let's say, conservation actions and stewardship within the system. So there, I spent my 20 years working in San Francisco Bay, particularly, and before coming to and engaging in the Delta, and it was a very different place just because of the the composition, an urban centered environment looking at its resources and how to protect it, as opposed to a more rural based setting where people are interested, have let's just refer to it as the Delta as place, which is, they've all grown up in it. They view it as cherished to them, similar to the way people in the Bay look at the edge of the Bay, and but from a different lens. And so all things related to conservation planning and that kind of thing need to consider that as they go forward. As far as policy direction, I mentioned that we're guided primarily by statutes and regulations, but policy is also provided by the Fish and Game Commission, which establishes hunting and fishing regulations and provides guidance to the department from a policy perspective, and also makes decisions about the listing of threatened and endangered species into the State Endangered Species Act. The department also operates under policy guidance from the governor's office and from the resources agency, things like the California Water Action Plan, current efforts under the Cutting the Green Tape initiative to facilitate particularly restoration planning and implementation within the permitting structure, things like the Delta Smelt Resiliency Strategy that from about 2017, which was an effort to voluntarily implement actions to try to recover Delta smelt, in addition to the regulatory requirements. And other legislation, AB 2402, which mandated the department manage and look at things from an ecosystem-based management structure and apply adaptive management. And in the ecosystem-based management, it focused on, not just fish and wildlife resources, but those in the context of in a social context within the community and how those things are integrated. The Wildlife Conservation Board is also a component within the department that supports its conservation actions through grant making and its funding as a funding source. Next slide. Here's a long list of things that we do. Primary among our activities is the trustee role, which applies or goes into particularly how we address our regulatory programs and implement our grant making programs, which we have a fairly substantial amount, along with other agencies. When I was with the Water Branch, we managed the ecosystem restoration program, which came out of CalFed and was a component of that. And we had fairly large sums of proposition money to make available for habitat restoration to implement the objectives of the CalFed Bay Delta program, and particularly focused on ecosystem restoration, but also funding fairly substantial programs to look at wildlife-friendly agriculture and supporting those kinds of activities. In addition to its resource responsibilities, the department's also a significant land manager, managing over 1 million acres and probably in the order of 30 to 40,000 acres within the Delta and Suisun Marsh. Next slide. Trustee role, again, we provide advice to our sister agencies and other state agencies. It relates as their activities relate to fish and wildlife resources. We provide input into things like the California Water Plan and land use plans, particularly at the local level, general plans and those kinds of things, as well as working with agencies and providing input on planning and implementation of projects and how those agencies make their decisions relative to those projects as they affect fish and wildlife. And also recognizing that, in many cases, what they approve may ultimately have to come to the department to get a permit. And so we try to work in advance or as early as possible within the process to incorporate the department's concerns in fish and wildlife conservation measures to ensure that once it gets to us, it's permittable. And that is critical in our role as under the California Environmental Quality Act, where we serve as trustee to provide advice. But we also serve as a responsible agency where we have permitting authority, and then also as lead agency on our own projects. Next. And just kind of going to what we were asked to consider in making our presentations, what are the key challenges in effective governance within the Delta, and from our perspective and or the state perspective, are resources to effectively collaborate and conduct outreach regarding the department's programs. One of the things that is key, as I mentioned earlier, is having the ability to engage in sustained interactions to develop plans that are acceptable. And I think before we started, Don mentioned I think it's the South Sac habitat conservation planning. Those efforts take extended periods of time to develop, to get to implementation. One of my most rewarding experiences was working on the East Contra Costa County Conservation Strategy Plan. While it was probably the fastest developed habitat conservation plan, I think, in the state's history, it's not recognized that there was probably 10 years of pre-work that set the stage for that to be able to come to fruition. So next slide. As far as information sharing, the department strives to coordinate closely, particularly with our state and federal counterparts, whether they're resource management agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service, since we co-manage many resources together. We operate hatcheries together. And so there's a great degree of interaction that's required to make sure that we're not working at cross purposes and that we're coordinated. And in many cases, try to coordinate things to make sure that we facilitate, let's say, permitting when we have overlapping permitting authority, particularly under the Endangered Species Act. The state act lists species, the federal act lists species, and where they are co-listed, we both provide authorizations, and there are some differences between those acts, and they need to be coordinated to make them work together. And also within the larger conservation planning context of HCPs and NCCPs. The department, certainly encourages landscape planning and fosters that. As I mentioned, that takes a lot of intensive interaction over many years to make those kinds of things work. Next slide. This is, probably the knot that Mark laid out with the web or Maven's scribble. This is where it gets, very complicated. Many decisions get made at let's say the state level or the state federal level, and are not really subject to that much local engagement. I think that's something that has to be recognized, that it's important to make those connections, although there are, some fundamental differences in the way people in the Delta look at things relative to, what the broader statewide perspectives might be, or the limited roles of a particular permitting agency might be. And then particularly the conflicts that arise with, and these have existed since the CalFed days of, habitat restoration, and what is habitat restoration in the context of the Delta in particular, but how implementing that affects local economies, the agricultural community, and those kinds of things that particularly in the rural setting are key considerations. I think ways to address, and there's some good examples out there that have come about. The Yolo Bypass Cache Slough partnership, that's a state, federal, local effort to come up with a conservation strategy that addresses multiple benefits within the Yolo Bypass and Cache Slough and the Yolo Basin, whether it's flood protection, fish enhancement, wildlife management, and those kinds of things, and addressing regulatory issues that may arise from implementing conservation action. Another tool that, I think doesn't get enough attention is the Delta Conservation Framework, which the department developed and encourages locally driven conservation planning. So it's not us coming in and dictating something from above, but engaging with the community to look at multiple benefits that can be associated with conservation planning. And Frank's tract, I think, is an attempt to apply that in an effective way. And then also things like the Sassoon Marsh Restoration and Management Plan, which was another long, tedious process, but ultimately came to develop a plan that had multiple or broad stakeholder acceptance within the marsh. Next slide. And then how are agencies held accountable? I think the Delta Plan consistency requirements provide a level of accountability that may not have been there previous to the Delta Reform Act. From a science perspective, the Independent Science Board, which is charged with looking after the effectiveness of adaptive management in the system, but also reviewing and providing science guidance more broadly. And then the California Environmental Quality Act, which requires agencies to go through a public vetting process of their activities. And they may reveal the effects of what their actions might be. And that applies to the department, both from projects it might want to implement, but also regulations it adopts. And that goes to the regulatory process, and then ultimately the courts. So we like to try to stay away from the courts and address those kinds of issues more proactively and upfront. Next slide. And how do levels of government interact within Delta governance? Most of the department's actions or interactions are at the state and federal level, as noted previously, but certainly we're engaged in the Delta, in the Yolo Bypass Cache Slough partnership and other partnerships more science related within the greater Central Valley. And I think those are the types of venues that can be most effective in resolving, let's say, landscape issues and engaging more effectively with local agencies in government, whether it's at the county level, city level, or with reclamation districts and that kind of thing. And another example, more specific, are things like the Fremont Weir Big Notch project, which has involved significant engagement by DWR, in particular with local agencies, particularly Yolo County, trying to resolve issues there. Next slide. I think, from the existing coordination issue, again, I think there's an increasing recognition on the state's part that, effective coordination needs to take place with local governments. The difficulty in many cases is that there isn't necessarily common ground and or a lack of trust, and trust building is difficult and time consuming. So, it really takes a lot of effort to build effective relationships between governmental agencies at all levels. Next slide. Opportunities for greater coordination. I think, DPIC provides an opportunity which brings together state and federal agencies working within the Delta and involves, a local perspective through the participation of the Delta Protection Commission and the Stewardship Council. Collaborative planning processes, as I mentioned before, and then applying things like the Delta Conservation Framework to planning activities within the Delta. And that's something that we push for grants that we issue within the Delta. And then also providing resources to local agencies to engage as a partner in planning activities. And that goes not just to local agencies, but also, let's say, tribal communities that should be engaged in these kinds of activities as well. Next. Next slide. Thank you. I hope I didn't go over too far.
Thank you very much, Carl. We gave you a lot of questions to talk about, so that was really thorough and informative overview. So thank you very much. We'll move on to our last but certainly not least presenter, Supervisor Don Natoli, who has served on the Sacramento County Board of Supervisors since 1994, representing District 5, which encompasses 650 square miles and includes the cities of Galt, Ileton, Elk Grove, and Rancho Cordova, as well as rural farming areas and communities in the southern portion of the Delta. Currently serving his 7th term, Supervisor Natoli works with people throughout the district and the county to address a range of issues and social services, law enforcement and public safety, recreational and cultural programs, budgetary matters, and programs serving children, families, and seniors. Supervisor Natoli also serves on a variety of boards and commissions, including as chair of the Delta Protection Commission and a member of the Delta Stewardship Council. Really pleased to welcome Supervisor Don Natoli.
Well, thank you, Chelsea, and good afternoon to all the folks that are participating in the Brown Bag. And I want to thank my fellow panelists. I always learn something new, and I appreciated certainly Mark and Kaylee's and Carl's presentations. I don't have a slideshow to follow, and so I'll take a few minutes here to share some information on the topic, and hopefully I will kind of watch me on the time here, as I know we want to have questions, and I've seen a number of those come through the chat room. I want to say, though, that certainly in looking at the slides and hearing my colleagues' presentations, that it was clear, if it wasn't clear before, certainly I think just in today's presentation, that there are multiple agencies, dozens and dozens, and responsible parties, and yet there are different layers too, and I think some dimensions to all this. And I wanted to just note too, thank Dr. Larson for her introduction. I just had noted earlier today that she talked about the native inhabitants of the Delta, but certainly of California, and the early settlement in Sacramento County was established in 1850. And so, 172 years as a local government entity, and obviously the evolution of society and certainly of the state and of its communities, brings us to the point this very moment today where we're talking about, some of the impacts, certainly on the physical landscape, but also then how we govern and how we arrive at decisions and carry out fruitful pursuits in light of all those multiple layers and multiple responsibilities. And I'm sure, 170 years ago, things weren't quite as complex, but they were probably challenges of the day, just we face challenges. And I want to say too that as I move into my comments that, one of the themes that I take away just from my colleagues, and I know I noted in some of my notes, this whole focus on trust. And that, as Carl, I think aptly said, that's time consuming and requires a lot of work. But I'm a big believer, certainly as one who's served in local government and been given, tremendous responsibility and privilege of serving at the local level and working with colleagues that are represented here today, their agencies, and a multitude of others, including county supervisors and city council persons and directors from reclamation districts and fire districts and school districts and all the various special districts that provide services and have some framework of responsibility, not always that relates to the natural environment, but certainly to the built environment and to daily life in the Delta, but certainly in our communities, our region, and our state and nation. And I think it's very, very important to recognize that the role that we play and where we come into it in the agencies and or entities that we represent, have a public responsibility by the very charge that we're given, and whether it be a very distinct role in a special district or a broader one that a county or city might have related to municipal services or to countywide services that include public safety and road maintenance and social services, or state and federal agencies that have very broad responsibilities and multiple layers, as you would point out in the slides previously. And so I think even as challenging as it may appear, my experience has been that if you work to achieve a basis of trust, certainly from an institutional standpoint, but working relationships, that does help advance. And I think it goes to the point that was pointed out in Mark's slide. Someone who I've known for all of my career, former Assemblyman Phil Eisenberg, who was the first chair of the Delta Stewardship Council. But I think imparted his wisdom in that, yes, you have a messy situation and you're trying to find effective leadership, but those relationships and that basis of trust is so very important. So with that kind of as an introduction, I just would say that a couple of I think, important things to point out too, that there are, 5 Delta counties that comprise about 4 million people of the, 40 million Californians. And within the Delta, there's about 500,000 folks that reside in the Delta, and some of those are incorporated cities, and others are in, as Carl alluded to, live in more rural settings, the legacy towns, communities that were part of the early settlement, not just of Sacramento County, but certainly of the other counties in the region. And I would also note too that the Delta is, and I've said this many times, I think a place of, certainly unique attributes. It's a place of wonder and awe. It's also a place where the folks call home their daily lives. It has the rural intermixed with the, more urbanized perimeters and some of the cities that are within the legal Delta. But it is, a place of a lot of focus. And I think that in of itself is of a benefit, particularly with some of the challenges that we see. And I think today's topic about environmental governance and how we get to solutions and utilize, best utilize the resources at the various levels. I would say too that one of the challenges that I've certainly observed in my years of experience has been that, in the decision making, folks have defined roles, but that when you have, as much as it may deflect sometimes the ability to move as quickly as one would like, either from an agency perspective or from an entity, if folks share certainly and seek out not only the common ground, but sharing the decision making, I think that the solution sets, as difficult as it might be to achieve at times, and whether it's the goals of the Delta Reform Act when it comes to water supply reliability and certainly ecosystem restoration, as both talked to here today, and then the broader qualifier is very important as it relates to the unique values in the Delta: agriculture, environmental, cultural, historical, and recreational. That if you focus on not only what the statute calls for, but then in trying to find those solutions, that there are wins that come along, and even with all the multiple layers. So just let me take a moment too, and it's been touched on in some of the other commenters' presentations, but back in 1992, the Delta Protection Commission was first established, and its construct is unique, I think, to many other state agencies, in that you did have local representatives, you had county supervisors, city council representatives, regional representatives from a couple of the council of governments, and reclamation districts seated with state agencies. And then that construct was reconstituted with the Delta Reform Act in 2009, which then established the Delta Stewardship Council, as well as the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy. And again, a lot of that was the outgrowth, obviously the focus, as Kylie had noted, with the CalFed work and work that Carl and a number of state agencies have been involved in. But I think one of the really important points, I would, if people look back this past decade or a little more now since Reform Act, the structure where you have the multiple layers, but you have a Delta plan that then requires the integration of the land use and resource management plan that the Delta Protection Commission is charged with, and in its construct of both local and state representatives. And then the fact that your elected representatives at the local level, in particular your counties, but cities as well, that have local land use authorities, which is something that obviously is pretty sacred to a lot of your local entities. But there are then other layers for Environmental Quality Act, meeting those obligations, and obviously with some of the things that Kylie spoke to relative to federal and state requirements. But local general plans have to be consistent with, certainly with the, in the Delta, with the Delta Land Use Resource Management Plan, and then with the Delta Plan. And my assessment of that, and certainly I have colleagues that from the other 4 Delta counties, which include San Joaquin, Solano, Yolo, and Contra Costa, in addition to Sacramento, who then share in some of the representation on those bodies. But I think there has been a recognition, one of the contributions that you're at the local level, the decision makers that are elected, but also that bring obviously sometimes a parochial perspective, and that gets meshed, as a couple of my colleagues alluded to, with a broader regional or statewide perspective. But I think it's been healthy, and I will say that sometimes successes are hard to pinpoint, but as was noted here, some of the projects in the Yolo bypass, I think, work to seek funding for levee maintenance and the things that are important for protection, certainly of the environmental construct of the Delta, but certainly of the daily pursuits that are the lifeblood of agriculture, and certainly of the Delta towns and Delta communities, and I think those relationships have been effective to a great degree in building some of the trust that was alluded to here. I also wanted to note that with regards to the distinct roles with the Stewardship Council, I sit on the Stewardship Council by virtue of the fact that I'm chair of the Delta Protection Commission. That was in law, and so you have guaranteed representation with a statewide agency, and then that's been very, very important. But when I think about the Delta too, and some of the efforts, and obviously there will be and have been and continue to be different points of view as it relates to introducing restoration efforts, but also then the whole issue, a lot of it revolves around water. I think it hasn't been spoken to here too much today, but frankly, from the Sierra to the sea, the Delta is at a very critical pivot point from both a natural environmental setting and one that has an altered, obviously, landscape with levees and the settlement, as noted, and then the critical aspect of water that then is moved throughout the state, but from north to south, and that which then also flows into the bay and certainly into the sea. And so, it's a very critical, point of demarcation, not only from political and environmental, but from the standpoint of daily life. And one of the roles of a local representative, obviously, is to attempt to be a clear voice for folks, certainly from that local perspective, but also then to work for solutions with those agencies and entities, of which there are a multitude, to find solutions to things that are either embedded in state or federal law. And so I guess I'm encouraged to the degree that I've seen certainly during my terms of service, this a lot of effort put forward, and certainly folks that are on the panel today have been a part of that, not only in the way they've reached out, and I think the reliance and emphasis on science has been very, very helpful. It's been helpful to local efforts, but it informs all of us, whatever our respective role. And then you work through the political piece of it as it relates to if you're going to change land uses of with that local authority, and whether that be for some other use in agriculture, or what it has been in for generations, or if it's taking lands that were farmed for generations and putting them to other uses. That whole cooperative approach, though, and that shared decision making, to the degree that it's observed and I think respected amongst the various parties, I think does build the trust. I wanted to note too that a couple, I think, of recent achievements that again are a testament, I think, to some of the work both at the local level and with the bodies that have been referenced here, but also have involved state and federal folks to a large degree. And just in the last few months, few weeks actually, the Delta Protection Commission adopted the template for the Great Delta Trail, and that's been an effort for many years, looking to link various communities and counties throughout the Delta, but certainly east, west, and north and south of there. And so that effort will be a many decades long as far as seeing actual trail and all the connectivity. But a lot of work went into that, and I know has been supported certainly in state legislation as well. And the other one, though, that I think is a real, again, we're still working on the resource management plan, is the National Heritage Area, where having the Delta designated as a National Heritage Area, and the management plan is currently in the development stages. We hope to submit that actually to the Department of Interior later this year. That's the goal. And again, it doesn't impose necessarily another layer of governance on the Delta, but I think it will bring to bear certainly a focus of the importance of the values that I noted a moment ago, that are noted certainly in state statute, but that are important to daily life in the Delta and all the various pursuits, but also folks who have an interest because of some of those values. And so that in of itself was a major achievement. And I would just note that, again, that required tremendous cooperation at various levels. And so, if I was going to sum this up, but I know we want to allow some time for questions, that I would just say that I think there's a reason to be very hopeful. And part of that is, the representation, even though that can vary from political cycle to political cycle. I know that the counties and local districts and communities are committed to their work at the various levels at which they are represented. And if I had to sum it up, I guess I would just say that that I'm hopeful through activities like today, and I appreciate all the folks that hosted this, to continue work and having good, solid, dependable science, effective leadership and representation. Communication was alluded to, I think, in Mark's opening comments, of being forthright in our communication. A lot of hard work, because it's going to require that, a dedication to actually trying to achieve environmental restoration efforts and maintain, obviously, community life, and basically to establish a basic, a basis of lasting trust. I think we can really manage a messy situation, to reference Phil Eisenberg's comments, and I'm hopeful that we can advance the stated goals of certainly of assuring and achieving the water supply reliability, ecosystem restoration, and do it in a way that really respects the values, preserves and protects and enhances the values of the Delta, as I noted, that are very important. And even with multiple layers, the fact that we're having this conversation today, I think, is healthy, and it just continues, I think, to help us progress to to a goal of, protecting the Delta, but also recognize its importance from so many different aspects of our state. So with that, I'm going to head and stop. I think Chelsea's ready to take a few questions here. And so thanks for allowing me to participate again on this panel today.
Thank you very much, Supervisor Natoli, for another excellent presentation. I think we've heard quite a bit of insight about the many challenges facing governance in the Delta, but it's nice to end with some reflections on where there's room for hope as well. So thank you. And thank you again to all of our panelists. I think that was a lot of information that we covered, but highly insightful and illuminating. We have quite a few questions. Thanks to all who have submitted questions, and we will get to as many as we can. I'm going to hand it over to Jess to take our first question.
Okay, well, thanks all for the presentations. Echoing Chelsea, those are excellent. So we got a question about Delta legacy towns and how they interact with federal and state governments. And I want to broaden this question a little bit to talk about coordination from the local up to the federal level, which I think builds quite nicely off of Don's final remarks there. So Mark introduced the social science concept of multi-level governance. Kylie and Carl both presented on some of their respective levels of governance and how this works. And then Don wrapped up speaking from the local perspective. So given we have a couple minutes here for Q&A, I'm just wondering if you could all offer your sort of 1-minute sound bites on how this multi-level coordination works. What are the biggest opportunities for improving that coordination across levels of governance?
I can jump in. I think that it sort of goes back to what Carl was talking about building trust and getting to know people, working with them sort of where they're at. We do participate with local entities when we're invited to do so. And so I do think there are those opportunities, but we each have to take the time to build those relationships.
And Jess, I would just offer that I think part of it is then, once you've developed those relationships to then, to the best of people's abilities, because sometimes obviously direction gets changed from a level beyond the control of anybody on this panel in our respective role. But I think is actually fulfilling commitments that are made, and whether they be embedded in agreements or in, in law, I think it's really important. And I think that's been part of the challenge with folks at the local level, is that they see things that are promised, that are embedded in law, and then they also see where there's a breach, and it can be fairly significant. And again, it's not because they've been intended to do it going into it, and when it comes to water policy, it gets to be very, very, very challenging. And again, water is essential to life. It's essential to everything we do, just about, and it's key in the Delta and water quality and supply and such, and it's key to other areas that are dependent upon it. So I think that, the follow through and fulfillment, and there are some good examples. Carl alluded to it. I think Kylie touched on them in their comments, and some of those efforts, begin to build a foundation by which you may have a setback from time to time. But I do think that allows you to make forward progress in a way that people pull together on a lot of the issues, even if they have differences, and maybe strongly held on certain aspects of public policy.
Yeah, I think those are all, great points, particularly Don's. I just would point to, while it hasn't come to any kind of fruition, the Frank's Tract efforts that have been undertaken to develop, let's say, restoration activities that address some of the more existential problems of the Delta from an ecosystem perspective, but also engaged with the local community and focused on the local community's interests in recreation, the economic health of particularly Bethel Island, the hunting and fishing community. So I think part of the issue there is being able to sustain these kinds of planning efforts, as Don pointed out, and carry them forward to some actual fruition. I think we got to a good point, but now, this goes back to leadership, and we don't have a leadership component there to pick up that and take it to the next steps, whether it comes from the local community that says, look, we spent time on this. We think it makes some sense, and getting the resources to further that planning effort. And I think it's an example of how we have to pursue ecosystem restoration within the Delta, or because, you know, we've done all of the easy stuff around the edges, and it's really, we have to work on fundamentally changing the structure of the Delta to overcome some of the consequences of reclamation.
From my perspective, we need to train more leaders about how to navigate these systems. It's one of the things that I think is a gap in all of this, is that often when we talk about improving coordination, somebody says, let's create a new form, or let's create some new structure or something like that. And that's, you know, sometimes worth it, but we have lots of structures, lots of projects of various sorts. And I think things like what we're participating in right now, and just like developing more leadership training so that people think about these systems and how to navigate them, and the importance of things like trust, can really help like get people working together more effectively within the structures, to think more carefully about when it's appropriate to change or create new ones and things like that. And so that's a component that I think is a gap.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. We are unfortunately out of time. I'm sure this discussion could have gone on far longer, but we will close out for today. I want to thank all of our speakers again for attending and for sharing their perspectives and insights. I personally found that extremely enlightening. So thank you very much. Thanks to all who attended here today, and thank you for submitting your questions. I am sorry we didn't get a chance to address more questions. We will pass those along to our speakers in case they're able to follow up with some thoughts. I'll also reiterate that the recordings will be available, and I will send that link around to everybody who registered. Please do register for the upcoming webinars on April 13th and May 5th. The link is available to the promotional flyer that's in the chat. And I hope to see you all there. Thank you again for joining us, and have a good day.
Thanks for your time, everybody. Happy
Thank you all.
Take care.
day. Bye-bye.